Welcome to Transforming with Drew, where we talk about all things transgender from F to M to M to Fs and how to change your life for the better. So today we're going to talk about what exactly is transgender. So if I were to go to the dictionary, it would say transgender is an adjective denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex, really. If I were to ask anybody, myself or anyone else is transgender, they'd pretty much sound the same, but we would also say I was born in the wrong sex and I just want the outside to match the inside, which is what I'm doing. Now, we do actually have a lot of history regarding transgender people. And I would like to actually start back in time. We're going to go back around the 50s first because I want to talk about one of the first famous transgender women in the United States. In 1952, her name was Christine Jorgensen, who was actually born George William. So, like many other people who were born transgender, she felt like she was different from the rest of the boys. Christine had even several conversations with her mother growing up about feeling different, and even once asked, "Mom, why didn't God make us alike?" And Christine's mother gently explained that the world needed both men and women, and that there was no way of knowing a baby was born whether it was going to be a boy or a girl. Mind you, we do know now, but you get the idea. She was being really supportive. Christine's family was actually really compassionate, and they were really close together. They were so supportive that her grandmother even had her express herself as who she felt like. And even though Christine knew she was attracted to men at the time, she knew deep in her heart, she understood with every fiber of her body that she was female and not male. Christine was later drafted into World War II, where she actually kept herself because she was in fear of going to prison for attraction to men, because back then you could actually go to prison or get dishonorably discharged. Kind of a big deal. And initially, she actually tried to go in the military before she was drafted, but they dismissed her based on her dainty figure and smaller frame. After she got out of the military, she went to school for photography and then studied to be a dental assistant, but was still unhappy. She came across this book called The Male Hormone, which kind of sparked her to start taking estrogen. Around 1950, Christine went to Denmark to undergo a series of experimental surgeries to change her body to match who she was on the inside. Dr. Christian Hamburger diagnosed Christine with being transsexual. She was actually the first person to be diagnosed with this term. They actually later removed Christine's penis, but was actually not received a vagina yet until years later in the United States. Now, word did come out about Christine, and she was on the front page of the New York Daily News on December 1st, 1952, under the headlines, "XGI becomes blonde beauty, operations transforms Bronx youth." Christine became a huge overnight sensation. They followed her and her story for weeks. She was actually even named Woman of the Year by the Scandinavian Societies of Greater New York. Sadly, when they found out Christine only had her penis removed and did not yet have a vagina, many of her supporters backlashed her because they didn't feel that she was woman enough, and the media kind of began to shun her. Then, Christine finally went under a vaginoplasty performed by Dr. Joseph Angelo and Dr. Harry Benjamin in May of 1954. She worked in Hollywood but never actually made it big. She was a nightclub singer, and she even found love. However, she was unable to get married due to the gender markers on her birth certificate, which personally I find very unfair. Christine ended up writing her life story and actually even helped others through countless of letters that were being sent to her to truly discover who they were. She was such an influence that in the 70s, they even made a movie about her called The Christine Jorgen Story. Christine would often say, "The answer to the problem must not lie in sleeping pills and suicides that look like accidents or in jail sentences, but rather in life and freedom to live it." She later on passed May 3rd in 1989 from a lung and bladder cancer, but we are still grateful for what she's accomplished for the world so far. Now, if we go even further back, we can kind of talk about the person who actually worked with transgender people, who is Magnus Hirschfeld, who changed Germany and eventually the world's view on sexuality. Many people actually say he created the word transsexual and transvestite back in 1919. Magnus himself identified as a gay man who shared his life with partners Tao Li and Carl Gies. Magnus was not really particularly living the best and easiest life because he was eventually targeted for not only being gay but Jewish. He had to flee Berlin during the war. He was an outspoken man for the sexual minority rights, and even though he was like the first person to really advocate for homosexual and transgender rights, he was also the founding father of the first sexological institute known as the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. It actually became the first clinic to serve transgender people regularly. Magnus was later exiled to France, where he ended up dying in 1936, where his ashes were actually scattered in Nice. Now that we got a little bit of that going on, let's talk about the great Dr. Alan Hart, who published his homosexuality and his treatment in 1920, the F2M transitioning experience. Dr. Alan Hart was born Alberta Lucille Hart in Hell's Summit, Kansas. When his mother remarried, Hart was the happiest he's ever been. He got to live on a farm, he was free to present himself as male, and he played with all the boys, and even played with the boys' toys that his grandfather made him. Alan's family was also very supportive, just like Christine's, and they allowed him to actually express his gender back in the day, when his mother only randomly calling him a bit foolish for it. But it did even go as far as that when Alan's grandparents died in 1921 and in 1924, they actually listed Alan as their grandson. Then when his family moved to Albany, Alan was forced to play girl for a while and present himself as female. But every time he went back to his grandfather's house during the summer, he was allowed to be with one of the boys. His mother and his stepfather even allowed him to wear his hair short and wear some trousers. They really didn't care. And with a little resistance from some teachers, he was actually eventually able to submit assignments under this chosen name of Roberts Allen Bamford Jr. During college, Allen even had a romantic partner, Eva Krushman, who went to Stanford University. And even while obtaining a medical degree in 1917, he was still unhappy. Later on, Allen went to get therapy and radical surgeries to live as a true man in his eyes. He's actually one of the first to document F2M surgery records in the United States, right after only one man, Carl M. Bayer, who is also an F2M, to undergo sex reassignment surgery. We'll get to him in a moment, which was in Germany. In 1918, Allen married his first wife, Inez Stark, and they set up his first medical practice. He even interviewed with the local paper, and Allen stated that he was happier since I've made the change and I've ever had in my life, and I'll continue this as long as I live. I've never concealed anything regarding to my gender, putting his men's clothing, and I come home to show my friends that I am ashamed of nothing. Sadly, Allen was outed several times and it did not go well, and during this process he was forced to relocate every time. The stress was too much for Inez, who ended up leaving Allen in 1923 and later divorces him in 1925. Allen later remarried Edna Ruddick, who remained his partner until the end of his life. After the Second World War, Allen was finally able to receive synthetic testosterone, allowing him to finally shave and pass further than before. His dream. Allen's work in the medical field is actually unprecedented. He's one of the first to discover how tuberculosis was spread, which is a breakthrough in treating it because it was the #1 killer in America at the time. Allen passed away from heart failure in July of 1962, but he left us with these words: "Each of us must take into account of raw material which were hereditarily dealt with us at birth and the opportunities that we've had along the way. Then work out for ourselves a sensible evaluation of our personalities and accomplishments." Alan Hart is a trans man pioneer. And while I did touch on Carl a little bit, we can go a little more, as Carl would not have as much information on his life, but we have enough to get an idea of really who he is. As I said, Carl is one of the first transgender people to get sexual reassignment surgery, and it happened in Germany. He was also one of the first transgender people to gain complete recognition legally with his gender identity, and was even issued a male birth certificate on January 1907. Carl fought and gained the right to marry in 1907 in October to Believe Halpern, who later passed 2 years, on 1909. He ended up remarrying Eliza Max, who he was with until he passed. Carl was allowed to immigrate from Germany during the World War because he was actually a prominent figure in the Jewish community, to where even the German officers respected him enough, so they let him go to Palestine, which ended up later becoming Israel. In 1950, Carl started to go blind, and we don't have much record of him until he died in 1956, in which he was actually buried under the name of Carl Meyer Bayer. Now, this is just a brief history of transgender people who have changed the world, and we can see that we're not always hated, we're not always shunned. In fact, we were revered. We were pioneers. People sought out to us. And it wasn't always good, but it wasn't really inherently bad either. They worked hard. They lived their truth. They never stopped being who they wanted to be. The world loved them and accepted them. Carl, Alan, and Christine paved the way for trans people with the right mindset, and we can do the same for future generations. Now, I would like to remember all the people that did pave the way. So here's a few names. Look them up. Maybe understand. Again, we have Carl Bayer, Alan Hart. Now we have Dora Richer, Lily Elby, Christine Jagerson, Michael Dillon, Roberta Caldwell, Sir Ewan Forbes, just to name a few. So I'll leave you with this like I do every time. Live with purpose and live your truth. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please remember to hit the subscribe button. If you found this information useful, please share it with your friends or family members. Have a wonderful day.